Okay, get my gavel out, make it official. And good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and call this session of the City of Gig Harbor Hearing Examiner to order. The record today is October 4th, 2022 at 1:30 p.m. We have one item on the agenda today. It's got a whole lot of numbers associated with it. So rather than read them all off, I will refer to it as the Olympic Commercial Center major binding site plan amendment and CUP matter. So to that end, this involves a request for approval of a conditional use permit to allow a change in use for a building, as well as a major amendment to a binding site plan that was previously approved and recorded related to an approximately 1.28 acre commercial property at 5524 Soundview Drive. My name is Andrew Reeves. I'm a hearing examiner with Sound Law Center. The city has selected to hold certain land use application hearings like this one. And today it will be my role to collect evidence in the form of exhibits and testimony to determine whether this proposal is consistent with the city's comprehensive plan, zoning ordinances, critical areas ordinances, and the specific requirements for approval of a conditional use permit under section 1764-040 of the Gig Harbor Municipal Code, as well as the requirements for approval of an amendment to a binding site plan. And essentially that would be under chapter 1796 of the municipal code, and then specific criteria under section 1611-004 of the municipal code. I believe hopefully all those sites were correct, but we can talk about if I got any of them wrong. That said, in advance of the hearing, I did have an opportunity to review several exhibits. These include a lot of historic information about this site, including the previous binding site plan that was recorded, an amendment, I think, that had occurred, some other decisions that were previously made in the past related to this proposal, some administrative decisions that were made in relation to this proposal, the information and revised mitigated determination of non-significance that was issued for this proposal on August 14th of this year, and other information about the site, including information on adding electrical vehicle charging stations, which is something I hadn't yet mentioned, and the application materials themselves. Finally, a staff report that was prepared by city staff. So those were identified as exhibits A through N. I think to avoid confusion, why don't we make the staff report itself exhibit 1, and we can treat these all as attachments. But if anyone has additional exhibits they would like admitted into the record, let me know when it's your opportunity to testify, and we'll go ahead and address admitting additional exhibits at that time. I failed to mention all the notice information was provided as well in relation to the application, as well as today's hearing. And then there were a couple comments that did not express any concern from two tribal entities, the Squaxin Island tribe and the Squally tribe. So I did see all of that, just wanted to make sure I mentioned that. So anyways, if anyone has additional exhibits they would like admitted, let me know. And as I noted, I think all testimony today will be under oath or affirmation. That's because where my decision related to this matter ultimately appealed, the recording of today's hearing, as well as the admitted exhibits and my decision would serve as the foundation for any such appeal. Finally, the order we typically follow, and I believe we're going to follow it today, is first I'll swear in city staff who will give an overview of the review process and the proposal that led us to today's hearing, and then we'll hear from the applicant representative and any members of their team that may join to see if they have any additional information they feel that myself or members of the public should be aware of. Then we'll check and see if there are members of the public interested in testifying. We did not receive any public comments on this proposal, and so far no one's joined us. So we are not expecting a big group today, but if someone joins, they would have an opportunity to testify, and we'll go ahead and address that when we get to that point in the hearing. And then if necessary at the end, we'll go back to the applicant and city staff to respond to any such testimony. So with that, I think I can go ahead and get city staff sworn in. So thank you for being here. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth in testimony you give here today?
I do.
And if you could just state and spell your name for the recording and explain your role here at the city.
Carl Desimas, C-A-R-L-D-E space S-I-M-A-S. I'm the principal planner with the City of Gig Harbor in the Community Development Department.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. And did my explanation, as muddled as it was, of the exhibits hopefully track with what you were hoping I would review in advance of the hearing today?
It does, Mr. Reeves.
Great, thank you. Well, with that, I will let you go ahead with your presentation, and then I'll probably have a question or two for you after that.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. And you summed up the project very well. This project does have a lot of past permitting and a lot of history. There's been a lot of review, and the city's worked with the applicant for a long time to get to the point. Originally, this site was approved for 3 buildings on 3 lots, and so there was a binding site plan that was recorded to that end. We had lot 1, lot 2, lot 3, and then building A, building B, and building C in that same order, respectively. The buildings were approved for certain uses at that time. There was a bank and two retail uses that were proposed. Subsequent to those original approvals and the recording of the original binding site plan, the applicant came in with an amendment to change the use of building C on lot 3 from retail, or it would have been a pharmacy, to a restaurant, a fast food restaurant. And since that time, that building has been built. It's a Carl's Jr. today, fully operational. And lot 2, when building C was built and developed, lot 2 was also developed as a parking lot with pervious pavement and so on, as sort of a temporary use, until which time as the building B would have been developed down the road. They also stubbed in utilities for building A on lot 1. So lot 1 has actually been partially developed to a point. And Mr. Halson can maybe chime in on that a little bit later as to what has actually been constructed out there. Since that time, the applicant has proposed another amendment to the site plan, and which required an additional amendment to the conditional use permit. So for building A, which was originally proposed as a bank, and I should back up one moment and just say that the reason for conditional uses in this case is because of the drive-through. So the drive-through use requires a conditional use per Gig Harbor Municipal Code. The underlying uses that are being proposed here today and were proposed previously are all allowed within this zone. So there's no question as far as uses go. It's really just the drive-through that we're talking about relative to conditional uses. And so under this new proposed amendment, the applicant has asked for the ability to vary the uses in building A on lot 1, including the bank, which was previously approved, and then also to include retail or restaurant, depending. So this conditional use permit would be an amendment to what was originally approved to add retail and restaurant into the mix under the conditional use permit. And those uses then would be essentially approved under a tenant improvement permit at the time that a building permit comes in from the applicant. And at that time, the city would then again potentially look at concurrency relative to traffic, probably depending on that use, because of the stacking lanes that are involved with that drive-through. So, and that's been noted in a condition as a recommended condition in the staff report. Also, as part of this current amendment, the applicant proposes to remove building B from the site plan and keep the parking lot use on lot 2. That would be shared parking to be used throughout the site plan. So the binding site plan meets the criteria of keeping one sort of contiguous site for, operationally and functionally. This site will operate as one contiguous site, even though there are 3 separate lots that are essentially subdivided by the binding site plan. Staff has reviewed this proposal extensively, both in planning as well as the building department and engineering department. We've had a lot of iterations back and forth throughout the process, talking a lot about landscape. There are definitely some constraints on this site, including the TPU power line easement that runs across it, the Cushman Trail easement that runs along the north side, and then the Highway 16 butting up against it in Soundview. So it's a very constrained site. So it's a tough one. But this site plan that's been proposed here by the applicant, we feel meets all of the approval criteria necessary for staff to be able to recommend approval of this particular site plan and the associated amendments, including the conditional use permit amendment for building A. As you have seen, Mr. Reeves, all of our staff analysis and findings have been laid out in the staff report on on pages 5 through 9 of this report. And staff has provided conclusions on pages 10 through 11, finding that the amendments proposed here do meet all of the criteria, relative criteria from the Gig Harbor Municipal Code. And staff has provided some recommended conditions if the hearing examiner chooses to approve this amendment here today. And those recommended special conditions are found on page 11 of 13 of the staff report. And they are 1 through 5 there. And with that, one other thing, Mr. Reeves, I'd like to note is that we kept one of the, when we issued SEPA, the mitigated determination of non-significance revision, all of the former mitigation items were addressed by the applicant over time. And so the one that was still potentially not addressed, and it's a little unclear in the record, but we need to get it ironed out prior to any kind of a certificate of occupancy, is the required pro rata share payment for the water. And so we've included a condition within the revised MD&S that would require that we sort that out prior to any development permit issuance.
Okay, and that's, sorry to interrupt, Mr. DeSimas, that's what's identified as the sort of required mitigation on page 5 of the revised MD&S?
That's correct.
Got it. Okay. And please continue. I apologize for interrupting.
Oh, no problem at all. And that actually concludes my my report at this time, and I'm available for any questions that you might have, Mr. Reeves.
Sure. So the only other thing that immediately I'm trying to remember from my review the last couple of days was that, did the issue related to the types of trees being as part of the landscape plan that was already resolved? What type of firs would be allowed, or just want to make sure that that issue was resolved as well?
Well, we've resolved it in so much as it's what's shown in on the current plans that have been provided as Exhibit C today do include landscape plans, and we would require that the landscaping meets that as a minimum standard.
Got it. Okay, so that was resolved to the extent that the submitted amended site plan with the landscape plan clearly identified the types of trees to the satisfaction of the city, so that if something else happens, there's the potential for code enforcement or some other mechanism we really hope we don't have to get into, but it's been clearly identified. I get a laugh from Mr. Halston, he knows, that we don't want to get into. Just wanted to make sure. I remembered, as you were saying, the issue about, as you were referencing unresolved issues, that popped into my head, so I just want to make sure I had asked about that, so thank you. And then, okay, so just thinking this through, Okay, so the CUP part of it, I understand, is because and this is the building not yet built.
Correct.
The extent the Carl's Jr. is built, it has, as soon as you mentioned the Carl's Jr., I knew exactly where you were talking about in terms of, I think the Harvester used to be over there. I don't know if it's still the Harvester, but that little strip over there.
Correct.
And now it makes more sense that there was another building or two proposed, because I always, when I was in that neighborhood, I always wondered, why is the parking lot for Carl's Jr. 800 spaces or whatever? Not that big, but so I think I understand the CUP for the drive-through, and then obviously with the binding site plan, it needs to be amended to the extent that it was already recorded. But the process for a major amendment with the binding site plan is essentially just look at it as if it were a new binding site plan under 1611-004. Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Reeves.
Okay, so now my next questions are, am I making a finding about an amended site plan versus a binding site plan, which seems to be two different things, as to the extent that the code has those provisions in chapter 1796 related to a site plan itself. Is that something I should be making a finding or conclusions about? I just want to make sure I haven't.
You, in my estimation, Mr. Reeves, you should be making a finding on both the site plan and binding site plan approval. The binding site plan has explicit criteria for approval as well that staff has also analyzed, and is recommending approval based on the applicant's proposal.
Certainly, but just to be clear, I think normally a site plan itself would not be something that comes before the hearing examiner, correct? This is being consolidated because we've got the higher level CUP and binding site plan. Is that accurate?
All right, that's correct. I misunderstood your question. I apologize. That's correct. The CUP is the reason that this has come before the hearing examiner, and that is because it is the type 3, and they submitted a consolidated permit package. So all of the permits underneath sort of are tagging along with the CUP, which is a little bit, I know it's a bit awkward in that sense, but that's how our code is set.
Not you. Actually, I think it's a smarter, I think it's good to sort of have, everything looked at once instead of piecemeal. And, and I certainly see this in other places. That said, the one thing I want to make sure I don't make decisions I ought not to be making, and the one that always trips me up has to do with design review. It appears that there already has been an administrative decision related to design review. I think that's in exhibit K. Is that right?
Let me look at that really quick.
There were some paint color changes, and Mr. Halson can ultimately speak to it, but if I remember right, I just want to make sure that design review itself, I think it's on page 4 of your staff report. I believe the decision's been made. I just want to make sure, I don't leave out a decision I myself should be making or not.
So these building A colors and materials, so the colors were changed for building C, which is the Carl's Jr. But this color palette that is proposed here is part of this proposed amendment here today. And so while it is an administrative approval, or could be an administrative approval for design review, because of the consolidated permit package, we're required to bring it before you for one decision on all of these permits together. So there would be some finding required there, I suppose, for the design review permit as well.
Okay, I'm glad I asked. So the decision that was previously made, the admin decision, was not that decision related to the Carl's Jr. I still need to make a decision for the as yet to be built new building, new structure. And so ultimately I'm making 4 decisions okay. So just to make sure, we're going conditional use permit, and that's specific really to the drive-through and its impacts, the binding site plan, the amended site plan, and then design review. Are those essentially, if I have 4 conclusions, one addressing each, we should have hit everything and I won't have missed anything. Is that an accurate assessment?
That's correct, Mr. Reeves. Yeah, and I'm sorry that I should have prefaced that at the beginning of my report. I apologize for the confusion.
No, again, I don't think it had anything to do with your report. I just think when you have consolidated review, I always like to really make sure I haven't, overstepped or underperformed in terms of what folks are expecting. And so, I think it's always good to walk through all that. So with that, I believe, let me just make sure. Going through my notes, 1 sec, I apologize. Yep, verified no appeals of the revised SEPA, so that's a non-issue. Okay, in fact, I do not believe I have any additional questions specifically for city staff. So thank you, Mr. DeSimas. And at this point, why don't we turn to Mr. Halston and we'll get him sworn in. Thank you for being here. Do you swear or affirm to tell the truth in testimony you give here today?
I do.
And if you could just state and spell your name and explain your role with this project.
Carl Halston, spelled Carlhalsan. It's in the record. I'm listed as the agent for the project. I've been working for the Richards since they started the project many years ago. And what's before you today, as staff has indicated, is simply going from 3 buildings to 2 buildings and changing the use of one of the buildings. I don't know how many decisions you have to issue. That's free.
I intend on issuing just one with sort of, appropriate conditions and conclusions. So,
all right. And then I just have a few notes throughout the staff report that I just wanted to clarify more than anything else.
Okay.
And actually, if we could go to the recommended conditions of approval, this condition number 3 that I wanted to make sure the record was clear on that. I don't think that most of this condition is necessary. And if you look back at staff's conclusion on page 6 of the staff report, where it says the applicant has provided a parking analysis based on the most intense use, which shows that the site will be compliant with parking requirements. So when the condition says that the applicant shall demonstrate compliance with, among other things, parking requirements, we've done that with the most intense use. And my client's just concerned he's gonna have to redo something that's already been done.
So real quick, I guess one thought, Mr. Allison, if that language were changed to the applicant shall ensure compliance,
Sure.
would that solve it in your mind?
I think so. And along those same lines with the stacking issue, because if you look at the approved traffic impact analysis, which I don't know if that's part of the record, it's from Greg Heath and Associates dated November 30th of 2021.
I don't recall seeing that. And if it was provided as a sub exhibit, I don't think I saw it, but I'd be happy to include it as an additional exhibit, especially as we're talking through these conditions. Mr. DeSimas, did I receive that? I don't recall seeing it.
You would have. It is incorporated by reference as an exhibit to the revised MD&S,
right.
And so we would provide it to whomever asked for it. But I suppose it is an important point that Mr. Halston's bringing up, that maybe that should be explicitly included as an exhibit, and we could, if it pleases you, Mr. Examiner, we could include all of those exhibits as sub-exhibits from the MD&S into and incorporate them in as exhibits.
Sure, to the extent that I appreciate folks trying not to have my record be too big, but now that we're not physically making copies, I'm a little less worried than how it used to be. I'm not trying to make tons of additional work for Michelle Thomas and others, but it would, I think, plus you probably have it in electronic form.
Yes.
I think it would be helpful to have any of those sort of referenced MD&S exhibits. We can just keep them all as part of Exhibit L. That would be helpful. But I think on this particular issue, Mr. Halston, just changing that one word, I think still would solve it to the extent that ensure compliance with parking requirements, and then including adequate stacking. It's, that clause would relate to the ensuring. As long as you're okay with it, and if Mr. DeSimis has thoughts on my changing that recommended condition in that manner.
I have no issue with that, Mr.
Okay,
Reeves.
I'm okay with, I'm always thinking ahead to what if Mr. DeSimis isn't here any longer and I've got a different planner who says, get me a new traffic study. I'm like, well, we just did this. So,
Right.
yeah, that kind of thing. That'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. And I myself am often guilty of thinking too far ahead as well. So I certainly understand. So the idea would be the applicant shall ensure versus applicant shall ensure.
And then the other one's a little bit nitpicky, but at the end of that condition where it says prior to the issuance of development permits, I just prefer that be building permits, only because a development permit could be the permit to do dirt work, which causes no impacts to anything. It's a building permit that causes impacts, or frankly, it's the occupancy of a building that causes impacts. But maybe since we're just ensuring compliance, that's not as big a deal.
And any thoughts there, Mr. DeSimis?
Well, just one. I know that one of the concerns that from the engineering department is relative to stacking lanes. And so when the site is being developed, I'm assuming that those stacking lanes are going to be included as part of the earthwork or the site development prior to building permits coming in. And if it's going to be a fast food restaurant that ends up going in there, the Public Works has some concerns about whether or not their cars will be stacking up out into sound view. And so we want to make sure that it's adequate when it comes time for us to talk about what that use is going to be. And so while use would likely come into play at the building permit phase, it sometimes does happen during the civil phase. And so I just wanted to kind of capture any contingency with using something more generic there than explicitly tying it to either civil or building permit. So that my preference would be to keep it as is.
Got it. So the thought being, while technically, it's not a use as it's not a drive-through bank or restaurant until you get the occupancy permit. If you haven't accounted for stacking during the site development part, you could have a problem later. Am I understanding your concern? What about issuance of applicable permits? Then the discretion is on city staff to decide what those applicable permits are. I don't know if Mr. Halson wants more power on staff side or not. I'm okay with allowing some discretion, but I certainly understand Mr. DeSimis's concern about the not putting the cart before the horse, or I guess the car before the stacking lane would be the, but your thoughts, Mr. Halson?
Well, I mean, again, this is probably not the hill I want to die on. We according to our traffic analysis that the city's accepted, we're over prepared for stacking anyhow. We exceed the minimums. So unless the code changes, we're going to be fine. And if the code changes, we should be vested anyhow based on this process we're in the middle of. So it's probably not that important. I prefer to have stuff like that on building permit than development permits. But again, if you want to leave it the way it is, that I can live with that.
Yeah, I think I do understand the point Mr. DeSimis makes. I understand your point, but this is a little different than, a building type use where the rest of the site doesn't really interact the same way. So that one, I think I'll leave in terms of that last part of the last clause in 3.
Well, I appreciate the consideration. And the only other thing I wanted to just get confirmation on, is Exhibit C, which the staff report says received April 28th. Just to make sure, again, because we're not all in the same room, that we're looking at the same document. The version that I think he's referring to was sealed by the engineer on April 21st, 2022.
Yeah, I've got date sealed by Craig Baldwin, April 21.
That's the one. I just want to make sure we're all 3 looking at the same one. Thank you, Carl, for confirming that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the extent of my comments, Mr. Examiner.
Okay, so that said, clearly you've reviewed the recommended conditions, and with the sort of change that I referenced in condition 3 from the word demonstrate to ensure, you don't see any issue with these. Obviously, we talked about the rest of that condition, but confident you and Mr. DeSimas can make sure to get this sorted out. But no other concerns related to those conditions, correct?
That's correct.
And then the discussion about trees, you obviously are aware of what their concern was, just
Yep.
making sure the right type of fir tree, blah, blah, blah. No concern there as well.
Correct.
And you agree that I am ultimately producing, what did we decide? 4, not decisions, plural, but I will have, my decision on this matter will address the 4 separate permits, as it were, that are being requested here.
That's correct.
Excellent. Okay. So I think we're all on the same page there. And I actually did not have any further questions. I'm just checking my notes one more time. No, I don't believe I had any further questions for you. Mr. Allison, anything final you want to add?
No, not at this time.
Okay, and it does not appear that we have any members of the public that have joined us. Yep, I don't see any attendees, and no one's broken through the police barrier to try to make comments there where Michelle Thomas is, so I think we're okay. Our planner, Mr. DeSimas, do you have any final thoughts or comments you wanted to share on this proposal before we conclude our hearing today?
I do not, Mr. Reeves. Thank you.
Mr. Reeves, can I get one clarification?
Certainly.
The applicant's address is an old address, mailing address.
Oh, hold on, let me pull up. And when you say, is that what's identified both in the staff report and in other places? I'm happy to update it for.
Yes. In the staff report, it's the 50th Avenue, and the new address is 2617 115th Avenue Northwest.
2617 115th Avenue.
Northwest, same city, state, and zip.
Okay. And ultimately, let's make sure staff got that.
I'm sorry, it's 98335, not 332.
I will update our system, and I'm putting together the additional Exhibit L right now, and I'll get it over to you as soon as I'm done.
Excellent.
Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, well then I think, did that conclude your thoughts, Mr. Halson, just to make sure?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Okay. Well, based on my review, I mean, ultimately having a binding site plan where we eliminate one of 3 buildings is not that challenging in terms of environmental impacts and other impacts on the vicinity. But obviously there's some details and complications I think that we've worked through. So my intent, once I do get the final exhibits, I'm sure that'll be by the end of the day, is to take all this under review one final time, but I didn't see any major red flags. So my hope is to issue a decision here in the next couple of weeks. I think we're finally getting caught up on my end. So the plan is to issue the decision here in the next couple of weeks, approving these essentially 4 requests in one consolidated decision with the recommended conditions, with the alterations we discussed, and the caveat, of course, that if I see something I haven't seen before, I obviously reserve the right to change my mind, make alterations, etc. But I think everybody knows that. So with that, I think we can end our hearing today. Thank you to the applicant for being available to respond to questions. Thank you to Mr. DeSimas also for helping clarify things, to Michelle Thomas for all the hard work she does. And I think with that, we can end our hearing. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.